Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another Founder and Friends. Today, I'm joined by Francois and Sasha from the Uno platform, good friends of Raygun here. Welcome, guys.
Hi,
Thank you.
nice to meet you.
Cool. And so today we wanted to bring the Uno folks on because we've been doing a lot of work recently around the cross-platform environments, specifically with .NET. And it's very hard to kind of go past Uno when it comes to doing cross-platform .NET. I've been coming across them a lot myself as I've been looking around over the years. I thought it would be a great opportunity to sort of learn together and hear a little bit more about how Uno is both empowering developers, improving productivity, as well as how do they differentiate from some of the Microsoft tools. I can certainly say from my own background, I've been a component vendor in the past, many years ago, selling into the Microsoft ecosystem. It has some unique challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss today. But I won't give away all of the stuff in the introduction here. I'd love to get a quick introduction from the two of you on just how did you end up where you are today, running Uno. And I'll start with you, Francois.
Thanks, Judy. Good to be here. So just to answer your first question, Uno is an open source platform to build cross-platform apps for mobile, desktop, web, embedded devices using .NET. Right? So everywhere .NET runs, Uno runs as well.
That's awesome.
And you were asking where it came from. We were originally app builders. We owned a consultancy agency here in Canada, and I had been building apps on top of the Microsoft ecosystem for 15, 20 years. Eventually started doing cross-platforms apps when Xamarin launched, even before Xamarin Forms. And that's where really we saw the need for a UI cross-platform framework sitting on top of .NET when Xamarin Forms wasn't even a thing.
Right. And I guess a little bit from you, Sasha, you're also one of the co-founders there at Uno platform, as I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I spent my whole professional life in the Microsoft developer ecosystem. At first, I worked at Microsoft Canada, then Microsoft headquarters. It was all about marketing and to developers and building communities around Microsoft products. One of my roles at Microsoft was an MVP lead, which is how I actually initially met Francois for the first time. I made him the MVP. About like 15, 20 years ago, right? It was long time ago. And then kind of our paths diverged at that point in time. I went and I, just like you, JD, I worked for a third-party component vendor called Telerik that many people are familiar with. And I was with them for a long time until they got acquired by Progress in the US. And sometimes there, Francois and I once again crossed paths. He showed me what he was working on, got quite excited, and I decided to come over and join. So that's the short story.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been a Microsoft MVP myself over the years, and it's a great program if you can be part of it. Also, just cutting back to you for a moment there, Francois. So you're a technical guy. I mean, I'm a technical guy myself. Often think it's somewhat kind of important for the leader of an organization doing dev tools to be a big old nerd. Tell us a little bit about what got you into tech in the first place.
Taking into what in the first place, sorry?
Getting into software and technology.
And software. Actually, my parents bought our first computer when I was 6 years old, and I started typing code from magazines to come up with like some super simple games and circle drawings and all that. And quickly I discovered BASIC and started coding back in those days, right? And it never stopped since.
It's such a common story. My story is almost identical, except I started at 8. So you're a bit of an early start on me. But yeah, I sometimes worry that that's something we've lost a little bit of with modern computing, is the ease of access to coding. On the one hand, it is easy to access. On the other hand, back in the day, the computer only had about 20 commands, and one of them was QBasic. So you kind of got railroaded into it, which is all good.
And there's also the exclusivity, right? Back in those years, that was a cool thing to do, right? It was versus now, it's everybody's got a laptop and a mobile device and all of that. So maybe some of that is lost, and I think it's on us to reignite that new generation of developers and make it cool again to be a developer.
Yeah, I love the creativity. There's a lot of talk these days about generative AI, and it's like, well, actually, coding is almost a form of art, and you're creating a new form of content. But at the risk of us ending up talking about AI when we're not here to talk about AI, we'll come back a little bit on Uno. So I'll tell a wee bit of my story for the audience here. Is that around the time that COVID kicked off, I actually decided as a challenge from a teammate to daily drive Linux. And so I set up Manjaro at home, and I did daily drive that for about 2 years. But I have a deep love for .NET and C Sharp, many years, and so I was already happy that .NET had become cross-platform. But then I ran into these problems where it was like, unless I wanted to put a face on it, like if I wanted a UI on Linux, I was out of luck. And so that led me to looking around, and I at that time, keep in mind this was about 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess. It's amazing how that time has flown. Is I ended up seeing the Avalonia framework, or sort of UI layer. And so I played with that, and I was like, this is great. I can reuse some of my XAML skills from doing WPF back in the day. But I also did start bumping into this term Uno around the place, and that did look like it was a lot more than just the UI layer. So I'd love to sort of hear the founding story here of the Uno platform and what really drove you to create it, and how does it perhaps differentiate a little bit? I know that's a lot of stuff in the story, but I'll hand the virtual mic over to you there, Francois.
Yeah, it's a valid question, and we get asked that pretty often. The reason why and what we're building as part of a broader story, it's part of a name, right? It's called Uno Platform. So that story goes back to the days when we were consulting, and we saw that we almost looked at it at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where if you want to become somewhat productive on a foundation and you want to be able to target all of these experiences across the various form factors and devices, you need a cross-platform UI framework. You need a cross-platform runtime on top of which would sit some form of cross-platform UI framework. But we saw in that pyramid a lot more needs, right? Like you need recipes and guidance, and it's not just about putting pixels on screen. It's about like interaction patterns and what the users expects, and like the various paradigms and how they're different between the various platforms, from navigation to authentication to like web viewing and all that. So that's what led to us to identify all these things that would be expected in terms of UX paradigms and UI paradigms and recipes and guidance, and try to provide that as part of a vertically integrated platform that is more than just a UI framework. So that's the origin of that story.
And so, and we're going to get to this a little bit later in the show, is talking about more developer productivity in a general sense. But what were some of the kind of key pain points that were below the UI layer, I guess, that you were trying to solve with the platform?
Yeah, some of the key challenges have to do with making sure that, first and foremost, like that you get the same experience everywhere in terms of how it looks and feels and behaves, right? So being pixel perfect across a variety of devices and form factors is a challenge in itself, especially if you want to be able to leverage native primitives so that your apps run natively at with native performance. It's quite a challenge because you need Uno to be able to abstract all of these differences at the UI framework level. So that's clearly one of the challenges, and that's why one of the approaches that is taken is also to support kind of a pixel-based rendering, which can be offered by technologies like Skia, right? That Flutter has been using extensively as well. So like those approaches help making sure that you have a uniform UI framework on top of which you can start building more components, toolkits, and guidance.
Yep. And how, maybe as a question to you, Sasha, you're sort of looking after the broader marketing and community. How have you kind of gone about building that community? Where would folks kind of find that community? Where are you seeing people? You sort of touched on it earlier, like we want to see people getting excited again about software development. Where are you creating those spaces?
We're creating them on, obviously, at our GitHub, at Discord, all the typical places where developers are. But let me just pause that right there and just try to augment what Francois was also saying, because I think it kind of leads into your question right now. Just like any founder story, I find, even though I wasn't around at that time, but I've heard this story told so many times that I've internalized it. Okay, so Uno was built just like many other startups out of a need. There was a consultancy, a rather big consultancy at the time, over 200, 250 people, lots of .NET expertise and lots of XAML expertise. And we needed to go beyond what at the time was Windows Phone and those kinds of applications to iOS and Android. So we're talking about like 8-9 years ago. So yes. we helped repurpose, and we enable our communities, of course, repurpose all that knowledge and reuse all that knowledge to be able to go cross-platform. At the time, iOS and Android, but then all the other platforms. But it is the just like any other founder story, usually successful founding story, is there was a founder who had a need and solved the need for themselves first, and then gave it to the world, right? So in that context, and now this builds into the community answer. We open sourced Uno platform, which is, I came at that kind of moment during that open sourcing. We open sourced it so that Uno can advance faster, right? So what I mean by that, it's the code base needs to start being evolved by more than just our internal developers, by the community. But not only the code base, but people putting it to use in various scenarios, various platforms, finding gaps and filling those gaps, or helping us fill gaps. Finding a bug, fixing a bug. All of those are great contributions to the community, to our platform community, and we're channeling that. So we're enabling that. To go back to your question, we are enabling all of that mostly on our GitHub repo as well as Discord. Although I'm going to say, I'm going to raise a hand. I think we made a mistake in a way. We moved our communities a couple of times, which so somehow you lose people. Some people don't find you again and all of that. So right now we are here to stay on Discord. We have our own Discord server. If you go to platform.uno/Discord, you'll land there, and it's a very welcoming community, very helping community. And basically, it's not just Uno people who come there, but it's any .NET developer, any XAML developer is an Uno platform developer. So it's a large community. We are part of .NET ecosystem, .NET community. So it's one big happy family.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of that community that you've been building on Discord, and this is more of a, maybe I'm just asking for me here. I use Discord, but not a lot. How have you found that in terms of adoption amongst the developer community? Has it been much of a barrier, or has everybody secretly got their gaming Discord on the side, at home, and have a login?
I can share some observations is that I find that people they like to have multiple online personalities, right? And I don't know what that is. I can speculate. But you're not going to get the same kind of question on GitHub. That is, a lot of developers are using their GitHub profile as their kind of de facto resume, right? So they want to put their best foot forward, versus they like to have this obscure Discord name. They can ask a quote unquote dumb question and not have it reflect badly on them. So I've noticed that people have multiple accounts, and I can tell sometimes that this person is that person. If I'm following, but I'm finding a lot of companies are having Discord servers these days. We initially started on Gitter, then we were a part of another Discord server, and then finally landed on our own Discord server. But yeah, I think that people find it very easy to hop around from one community to another. These being tech communities, not a gaming. Not a gaming community. It's really just interesting how it expanded into this use that, originally it was not meant for that, but it's definitely being used, and I see many tech communities on there.
It's a very cool product. It's disappointing how many things in Discord are better than like Slack or Teams, and yet it's free. So
Right.
just quickly, I guess for the audience who may not be Raygun users, but a little bit of the story behind Raygun in a similar way was that when I got my first job as a graduate developer, I met this brilliant engineer, Jeremy, and I remember thinking, God, how does this guy deliver such high quality software compared to the peers here that we were working with? And he demonstrated to me that he'd hooked it up. So this was in 2004, that he'd hooked up, always built his software so that it would send him an email when there was a fault. And he would kind of go, oh, well, I'll go fix that. And so we ended up, as I mentioned, we built all these components in .NET for WPF and data access and all this good stuff. And we got to the point where we were thinking about building a hosted service, which would be Raygun. And that was where we actually, to your point there, Sasha, we were scratching our own itch where we were like, we don't have our product sending us emails, but we need kind of some capability to collect all the fault diagnostics. And so really Raygun's crash reporting began out of how do we systematize this process to be more efficient so that we can, manage statuses, ignore the noise, pick out the priorities. And, by I'd say perhaps luck, but it turned out to be our most successful product by a long shot. And it did come out of the whole, actually, that idea we had many years ago that I learned from Jeremy. Jeremy was a co-founder in the company. Systematizing that was what led us to launching and being successful. And one of the sort of key cornerstones of that I've long been a believer in is around developer productivity. And I know that this is something that is really important to you guys as much as it is to me. I don't think developers like to think, I believe that, productivity is effective. Everybody likes to get stuff done. But there's the other lens, which is, it might not feel it some days, but developers are very expensive employees, and you don't want them mucking around too much. You need to keep people being efficient. I'd love to, maybe we start off with you on this one, Francois, but kind of getting a little bit of your view of the world from a developer productivity perspective, and then maybe how it layers into some of your ethos around Uno.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like we look at it, and again, like productivity going back to like servicing clients. Back then it was our consulting clients, but now it's our own Uno users. But we look at it, it's a known fact that today there's talent shortage across the board. Everybody's investing in IT, but budgets are being cut on a per project basis. And then those projects are even more and more complex, right? They're targeting more across more platforms, more devices, more form factors. With customization of IT, the expectations have grown for apps to be more polished instead of just being crappy enterprise apps that you would tolerate. And that gap, and being able to fix that gap, you cannot just like start magically finding 10x developers, right? There's something that has to be done. And we believe that with the proper frameworks, with like offering a platform that has everything you should need to be able to efficiently build apps, plus adding tooling that can help with code generation. You were mentioning Gen AI before, but like good experiences that support those frameworks, but offering tooling that surfaces those recipes and guidance. I think that's the way that we can solve that current and future problem we have in the market of how can we build everything we need to build with the resources we have, right? And that's what really drives the mission of Uno, of being a platform, focusing on productivity, and being obsessed about it.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. I must admit, I'm not a mobile developer myself, and I know you don't have to be doing mobile to be using the Uno platform. But a question that I've often had on my mind is that performance benefit of, do I build natively for multiple platforms? Do I use one of these shared cross-platform type solutions? I'm sure you get that question a lot, but I'm kind of curious for your take on what is the actual win here? Should I be thinking it's a 20% improvement for my team? And let's imagine we're going for like a PC, iOS, and Android, just to hit sort of some major platforms there. What's your take on the win of using a product or stack like Uno?
Yeah, so the promise is that you should be able to like maximize the amount of code you're able to reuse across platforms, right? Obviously, you're always going to end up with some platform specifics that may be abstracted in Uno or not. For example, like the sharing contracts, if you want your app to be able to share content with other apps, it might be slightly different in terms of data structures between iOS and Android, and there's no capabilities on desktop, or they're entirely different, right? So there's edge cases like this where like you might end up doing per platform code and implementation logic, but like if you're able to get to 95% code reuse across platforms, you should be in decent shape. You obviously also need to start, like, because you're targeting different form factors regardless of the technology, you need a mind shift as to how you approach those user experiences. They need to be responsive, like we've been doing in the web forever, right? But you need to see how they're going to adapt to various screen sizes, resolutions, and all that. And that's where you can have proper guidance and tools to help and like support those different form factors and responsive breakpoints and all that. But like in terms of reuse and getting all the benefits, we've witnessed and experienced that you can get like in the high 90s in terms of code reuse, so that you can really have a true single code base approach.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, Sasha, and to be straight up to our audience, this is not a sales pitch, but I saw some pretty impressive stories on your site about some of the customers that have used Uno to sort of either migrate, and we're seeing this a bit at Raygun right now. For example, with Xamarin becoming Maui, people are sort of looking around at the options that are out in the market. What's your sort of hero story that you're most proud of that you've heard about people leveraging the Uno platform there, Sasha?
It builds exactly on that productivity a story that you mentioned, because you can define productivity in many ways, or what does it mean in terms of tooling and whatnot. But I think one word that keeps coming up is reuse. So are you reusing your skills? Are you reusing your existing environment so you feel productive in? So you're not, as a new company or a new platform, you're not introducing too many changes that developers will hate or will actually hamper them. But the hero story then, coming from reuse, is also reusing old code. And one of our favorite customers, for many reasons, not only because they were so successful, but just such a pleasant team to work with, is a team from Kahua, who basically has an app that is running from single code base on probably all the platforms that we support. Right. Usually, what you have, to your point, JD, people have we support 8 platforms, but it's usually a combination of 3, maybe 4. But I think Kahua is the one that covers everything, all the platforms. And they migrated some 2 million lines of XAML and WPF code over to Uno. So what used to be a desktop app is now a app that runs in web, runs on WinUI, runs on mobile, on iOS and Android and Mac. All right. So that's usually the one that sounds the best, right? And it is one of my favorite, just because of the people and the relationship that we have developed over the many years that we have been working together. My other favorite one is the Windows calculator. Did you know that we converted the Windows calculator, the one that you have on your Windows now, to run on iOS and Android and Linux and everywhere?
I think I did see that was it a year or 2 back now?
Oh, it's one of our earliest showcases. So just for fun, when Microsoft open sourced the calculator code base, it's actually a C++ code base. So we had to do a bit of lift to C# first, but then use that to create a cross-platform application that runs everywhere, obviously. But it's right now, I think, the most downloaded iPad calculator, because iPad doesn't come with a calculator app. So it's used quite a bit there. So that is the most fun one, right? Because even if you were to go to calculator.platform.uno, you will get the web version of it. So that's Windows code base running on in a browser. It's really like, when the light bulbs come on. It's like, oh, really? This can be done? It's a great moment. I love showcasing that one. It's pretty much like, for me, the moment of, like, an aha moment was seeing, as far as WebAssembly goes, seeing that Windows 95 light up, in the browser. So that was, for me, it was amazing, and that's really one of the things that incented me to come to Uno, because they at the time were taking some very early advantage of WebAssembly, so this is our version of kind of that aha moment. You take that calculator and you put it everywhere. So those are my two stories, but there's many of them that I'm very proud of, just because when you see a big company adopt you, it just paves the way for everybody else to come after. So Toyota, for example, they are the ones who decided to rewrite their old Xamarin Forms app. Actually, it was, I think, 2 apps that they consolidated into a single application that is Uno platform run, and it's used for quality control. It's used for quality control in a Toyota factory, and Toyota is known for quality control and everything. So I'm very proud of that as well. So I'd say there's many, but I'm gonna go with those three.
Yeah, no, I'd forgotten a little bit about the open sourcing of Calculator. It's been a few years. I know Scott Hanselman was also behind the scenes on getting, was it Microsoft 3D Movie Maker converted
Yep.
to open source? That was a cool one that I remember saving up for as a kid in there as well. So let's make this a little bit more controversial, because we seem to be getting along pretty well and have a lot of shared views here. But what are the let's talk developer productivity, and let's talk some of the tar pits. Like, what are some of the problems that you're seeing in developer productivity today? And we didn't sort of rehearse this at all beforehand for the audience's benefit. So I'm going to give you one of mine while maybe giving a moment to ponder yours. We do a lot of stuff on the web, and folks listening will already kind of know, at least Francois and I and Sasha, we're old timers. We've been around the block a few times. We've seen a few things, man, and so one of mine in recent years has been React. I don't know if you remember the movie Contact, and there's that great line in it which says, why have one when you can have two for twice the price? I kind of sit there and I'm like, why have we got teams of 5 people doing what one person did 5 years ago? And I think everybody sort of bolted onto this, and almost to your point, Sasha, around like, hey, big companies drive behaviors. Everybody kind of went, well, Facebook does it, and it's like, yeah, well, Facebook's trying to get like 10,000 engineers to work on one JavaScript code base. You're 3 people in a startup, and one of the areas, this is why I'm a big fan of tools like HTMX. I feel like it's basically the update panel from from web forms in 2024. And it's been a huge win. We've started adopting that more at Raygun, because it's not to say React is bad. It's kind of like, you just don't need all those bells and whistles on every single page that's maybe a simple form. And I've seen that as a pretty big tax on web developer productivity in recent years. What are some of your sort of observations? And we'll start with you, Francois.
Yeah, we've definitely observed the same things, and we feel like the industry as a whole keeps reinventing the wheel, and it's a sad state of our science, right? Like, it's supposed to be called computer science, but we keep reinventing and not learning from the past, even though we sound like old timers. So, and I think the approach we took for this is, yes, build on the experience that we've had building apps, but try to really drive the innovation through a use case driven approach, right? What does it take? What's required? Let's look at functional and non-functional requirements and apps that need to be built. And can we match that and pair that to a set of guidance recipes? And if there's opportunity to just reuse existing packages, let's do it. If there's a way to maybe put some glue so that it becomes a coherent and cohesive package that is dependency injection friendly and that ties into the story of everything Uno offers, great. So it might be just small shims that we put in place to leverage Refit or Microsoft Kyoto as an HTTP client technology, right? So we're not here to reinvent the wheel for all of these, but we know what it takes, to do API calls. You need to think about authentication tokens and refreshes and caching and offline capabilities and exception handling and validation and all these concerns and cross-functional concerns that we're trying to identify and then come up with an answer. Obviously, you don't want to lock in an entire community into your own prescriptive guidance. So it needs to be opt-in and needs to be flexible and like replaceable and all that. But at least if we're able to identify the use cases and offer a solution, it raises awareness of as to everything you need to think of from an architecture standpoint when you're building those experiences. And at least you're offering a solution, hopefully, for all of these questions. But you've raised awareness, and that's the way we look at how we can stop reinventing the wheel and really put an aim like design patterns in a sense, right? Like, what are these key concerns and requirements, and what is our take on it?
Yeah, I'm going to loop back on the design patterns in a moment. But Sasha, just your take on some of the headwinds for developers in terms of being productive that you've observed in recent years.
I don't know. Can I pass? Can I take a pause?
It's a long list to enumerate. Yeah. Well, let's talk the design patterns then, as we've talked about. So this one was something we'd discussed a little bit earlier before the call kicked off. But, again, old timers chatting. But I remember sort of circa 2005 2005 maybe through to about 2010, there was a lot of discussion within particularly I want to acknowledge the .NET ecosystem. That was really the days of, you know, reading Allende's blog every day, seeing all the blog, the RSS readers were still popular. Everybody was consuming something. There was a lot of chat about how we structure our code with design patterns. Now, I know some folks think we kind of went overboard where everything should be a pattern, but it feels like in the last 10 years, we've seen sort of a bit of a loss of that, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Francois, of sort of saying we kind of lost a bit of the science of computer science in there. And so when we were chatting, I was talking about, MVVM and MVC and things like that. And you guys introduced this topic of MVUX. And I was like, well, firstly, anything with an X must be better than the other one. So like,
that's marketing. Yeah.
10 times better, actually.
Yeah. So let's talk about that design pattern, but also like what actually drove you to look at creating a new architectural design pattern for folks to use?
Yeah, it definitely came from us suffering and seeing the limitations of other patterns, right? So as everybody else, when we started using binding-based UI frameworks that are typically XAML-based, back in days from WPF and Silverlight and UWP and all that, we realized that MVVM brought like a great separation of concerns. You'd have all of your presentation logic separated from your view. You could unit test it separately from everything else, and you could then reuse it in theory with a new UI framework by leveraging everything you had. But what was the most important from these patterns is the reason they exist in the first place. So separation of concerns and being able to unit test your logic separate from the view and like have it run through continuous integration was important. But it also brought some challenges, right? If you're abstracting the UI, then how do you communicate back to UI? You need some glue in the middle with commands and identify property changes and all that. And then you need to figure out, as you're receiving messages from the view, are they being processed in the UI thread? Is it okay to stay on the UI thread, or are you going to hang and hug all of the UI processing available so that if you're making calls or doing processing within your app, your UI is going to end up being sluggish? And as you get answers from a server call, how do you go back to the UI? Are you on the UI thread? Because you can only make updates to the UI on a UI thread. So the underlying questions and concerns of being performant, being testable, making sure that you're UI friendly by going off UI thread as quickly as possible and going back to the UI thread at the last responsible moment, those are the items that we cared about. And those are more architectural concerns. And that's something important in everything we do. We try to understand like the whys and what's the underlying concern, because it could be another language tomorrow, another UI technology, but those concerns remain the same, right? And as you look as to how patterns have progressed, something that has always been fundamental across, like even with React and other approaches, is the underlying tone of, okay, can we have more of a declarative style of programming as opposed to super imperative, right? Can it be reactive so that we're reacting to messages coming back either from the server or from a user input or interaction with the operating system, as opposed to just event-based, kind of like not necessarily chainable and all that. So if we're declarative, we're reactive. What else is complicated today? State management. Okay, having a mutating state that you always don't know exactly, okay, I'm getting updates to the state. I was in the middle of doing something. Is there a better way? Yes, immutability, right? And that's what those patterns like MVU from a variety of technologies. Elm, like obviously it came from Elm originally, but there's other technologies. Flutter has given its take or took its take on it. So we looked at this and we're like, okay, can we marry the best of having a rich UI framework that has a great data binding engine, like what Uno has based on UI and all that, while keeping all the benefits of coding our logic for it to be declarative, reactive, immutable, thread safe, easily testable. And that's what we came up with MVUX. So it's an MVU implementation of our take on MVU while keeping and using source generators and code generation to make it compatible with UI frameworks that typically rely on an MVVM kind of pattern that has two-way data binding and all that. So what we did in a nutshell is we took an MVU pattern and we're generating behind the scene the MVVM adapter that the UI needs. That you don't care to need about, so you don't need to care about, so you don't need to think of threading, of state management and all that.
A little bit more.
I'm just going to add to that, if I could. It's really, and that's what that's why hence Uno platform and not Uno framework. I think that's one thing that JD, when you and I were talking at one point of time, I said,
yes,
this is what makes it a platform. This and other things, of course, that are either in market or are still coming, is that this team took all these years in all this experience in developing applications, and then picked out the best what we could and learned from other ecosystems and brought it to .NET and brought it to Uno platform, and making it a platform and not a UI framework. And there's a lot of opinion behind it, and you ideally buy into that opinion, but if not, there's still exit hatches or escape hatches. If you want to use something else, you can. So that's something that we also keep in mind at all times, is to make sure that we don't move developers away from things that they truly love, right? But if you want the true power of Uno platform, you're buying into the idea, into the vision, also into the vision that you can affect with your contributions, and use really Uno platform for kind of that end-to-end productivity.
Yeah. I'm just to that point at Raygun as well. In fact, prior to Raygun, you make the point there about escape hatches, and I think that's a really important point. I know not every developer will necessarily agree with this, but our very first product was called Lightspeed. It was an object relational mapper. This was before sort of Link to SQL and EF came on the scenes, and our approach was to be incredibly opinionated. We sort of borrowed a lot of ideas at the time from the Rails community of kind of saying, well, the default golden path should be the least amount of cognitive load as possible. Get out of the way. But then you do want to have those points where I think you can go too far on being opinionated, where you think people should never do things that are not your defaults. Versus, actually, I do have these 1 or 2 times where I have a legitimate development need to behave a little bit differently. And a normal example might be things like, and you shouldn't do this, but like you need to maybe pull reporting type queries out rather than wanting a lot of objects. So, maybe providing an easy access to the underlying ADO connection, if you need it, but otherwise you shouldn't have to be aware that there's an ADO connection at all sitting around. So I love that spirit, because I know from even building that product and seeing how many customers loved that, that is a huge win on developer productivity. It's just, don't distract, don't create too many speed bumps on the way to getting the job done in there. Now, one of the things we also chatted a little bit about this, Sasha, was the number of extensions and the way that you kind of think about providing additional capability if you do opt into the Uno platform. Is there a bit more of a story there around the extensions and the screen's turned off there, that are available? Like, are there things that people popularly do with Uno that maybe aren't part of the core product? What are some of the common things you see there?
Maybe I can take this one. Yeah. So the first one that we've probably created, which is the first thing you need to do in an app, is everything that has to do with navigation, right? And the general concept of navigation. And unless you have a single page application, at some point you're going to have to move your user to a second page. And when you're decoupling all of your business and presentation logic from your view, you need some abstraction of what navigation represents. And navigation could be frame-based navigation to push to the next page, but it could also be opening a dialogue, a modal dialogue, or a dismissible flyout. It could be putting dynamic content in a region within your page, and all these things typically fall under the umbrella of navigation. So we've created those extensions because like the UI framework by default didn't have any like abstraction for this. So this is an example of an extension within Uno, but there's tons of them. So authentication is the obvious one. Like there's a general purpose authentication mechanism that you can think of that would abstract your MSAL authentication, your OpenID Connect, or your custom authentication. So there's general patterns underneath of like receiving a token, refreshing a token, and all that. Right? But it goes into logging, it goes into exception handling and crash reporting. And again, that's a really good example as to, can we just provide enough value and then have a kind of a provider model where you can plug in third-party providers, and all we're doing is making sure that the entirety of Uno, and as you start with an app, you can already hook in, like you've created an app with our wizard, you've checked an option to get logging and exception handling and crash reporting, and then you've selected your provider and it just works, right? So like those defaults and having conventions over configuration by default for all of these cross-cutting concerns is key to how we're approaching being a platform and providing extensions over just being a UI framework.
And another one interesting, actually, I'm going to highlight too, just because I come from that space. My UI framework, UI components experience. But one of the extensions that we enabled is the MAUI extensions. So what this means is that you're able to take in mobile scenarios, in those scenarios that MAUI supports, those platforms that MAUI supports, you're able to take third-party vendors that have controls for those specific scenarios, and you're able to embed them within an Uno platform app. So there's your, love is in the air. It's a one big happy family on .NET side. And the second one is we have also developed our own UI, set of UI controls. And to Francois' previous point, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we didn't go out there and try to reinvent buttons or text boxes or data grids. For that, we rely on WinUI controls that are provided, on Windows Community Toolkit controls that are provided. In case of charting, it's the live charts or things like that. But we still found cases that are useful. We have really just a handful of controls, but that really don't exist in these other typical third-party providers. So we provided those, and they work out of the box with Uno platform application. So and they're optional, right? So those are going to be my favorite ones.
Yeah, you hit on an interesting point here too that I'd like to sort of touch on, which is within the .NET ecosystem. I find there's a lot of developers that sort of go just with whatever the Microsoft default is, and to be honest, and I'm sure I speak for all of us here, we're actually fans of Microsoft. In particular, the .NET division does absolutely awesome work. But I've often been a little bit disappointed at how few .NET developers kind of look a little bit broader in the ecosystem to say who's actually building on top of and supporting these things as well. And oddly enough, and I say this as a fan of Microsoft, a lot of people kind of have this sense that it's like, well, but they're big, they can be, they're going to be trusted, they'll be around a long time. And what I actually observe is that they churn their products a hell of a lot faster than some of these dedicated organizations. And so it seems like an unfounded fear to sort of kind of go away from the big dog, and it's like, actually, if I pick up something like an Uno platform or, even some of the stuff we did back in the day, it is your whole focus. It's everything you're about. You're going to keep owning and sort of operating that. And I think people undervalue that a little bit and should really look around. It also helps, I think, the ecosystem as a whole, the community work you're doing by bringing developers together that say have a shared interest in cross-platform, without it being singular technology focused, I think is a huge win. We are getting towards the end here, so I'd like to sort of get some final thoughts. But before I kind of get your final thoughts, if somebody is watching this and is curious to actually have a play with Uno, maybe just understand a bit more about it, where should they go? I'll show that to Sasha.
So of course it's our website, but specifically if you go to our docs, we have provided tons of ready-made samples. Anything to just kind of getting started with the initial, like simple counter apps to more advanced scenarios that showcase this kind of opinion, so our opinion navigation and things like that. There's tutorials on how to use our Figma plugin. We haven't touched on that, but we also we looked at the ecosystem, and we continue looking at the ecosystem, and we're trying to find places where there's gaps that need innovation. And one of those places was design to code handoff. So there's Figma is a predominant design tool out there, yet there's no tooling that takes designs to code and making this transition easier. And it's a ton of hours that get spent in trying to just translate all of that. So we innovated there. We created a Figma plugin that takes your designs right to Uno code. So we have a tutorial, for example, on that. So plenty of samples on our docs. There's a get started section. It's They spend a ton of time writing it. The only thing I wish I could do is make sure that people actually read when they go through it. Because what usually happens is that a senior developer will come and they're like, okay, you know what, I move that aside, throw away the manual, let me go right to it, and then they miss a step, and then it's like, oh my god, nothing is working well. Actually, so it's true, 100% true story. I take my non-coding friends and I ask them to I'm like, okay, let's put it to a stress test. Let's see if they can get an app running, and they come back with an app, right? So I'm like, okay, job done. It's not.
Yeah. Well, we see that. Firstly, I think your point about the doc site, I always think of like the main marketing site for Raygun. That's what you send the boss, and the marketing site for the developer is the doc site. It's the bit where you kind of go, how does it actually work? What is it doing for me? So share that view entirely. Also, just on that, we have a feature in Raygun now called AI error resolution, and it's exactly on your point there, Sasha, which is, it can give you a solution to, what caused this bug. And what I've found, embarrassingly, is quite often when it makes the suggestion, it's because I've forgotten one simple thing. It's not usually that it needed, something very complicated. I've just missed a step. And so unblocking people there is a win. We have also got some questions, so maybe I'll throw this question to you, Francois, as well as getting your final thoughts there. But we've got one here from Cody Coder. He's saying cross-platform development can face criticisms for sacrificing performance. I have heard that myself as well. Does Uno platform break this mold?
Yeah, so we're paying extra attention, and it's going to be an area of focus forever and ever. And the great thing is that Microsoft on the .NET side, because we're sitting directly on top of .NET runtime, they've been doing an amazing job at tweaking and optimizing .NET runtime, which allows us all the flexibility to simply make sure that Uno is as performant as it gets. So in the context of cross-platform apps, it's more than decent, and we're always on the lookout for extra tweaks. I wouldn't necessarily build games with Uno, which isn't intended for it, even though people have done it. But in context of apps, you can get absolutely fantastic performance.
Yeah. One of our key customers is TradeZero, which is a stock trading company. And we're talking milliseconds make a lot of difference, right? So if it's good enough for them, I'm pretty sure it's going to be good enough for everybody.
Yeah, I think you guys probably share the same challenge we do. I mean, effectively, we talk mostly about crash reporting, but we also, monitor performance and things like that. But, ultimately, you don't want the telemetry to have meaningful overhead. You kind of want that to be, and you'll never kind of get to fully zero, but that's, it's the treadmill of improvement. And, you mentioned the .NET runtime improvements, and I think it's really worth acknowledging Microsoft for that investment. I know that people in the .NET ecosystem understand how much work has gone into that, but I'll give you one little data point. One of our team this week, actually, he upgraded one of our tools from .NET 6 to .NET 8 and ran it through, benchmark.net. We had all of these different tests in there. And across the board, we went from, at the low end was a 42% improvement in performance, and the high end was like 84%. And this was going from .NET 6 to .NET 8. This wasn't like going from framework to the first versions of core. And it sort of blew my mind that there's still these sort of wins that are still landing in the .NET runtime. And if you've been a few years out of the .NET ecosystem, you're probably in for a bit of a shock at how different and high performing it is. Cool. And thanks for answering that question there as well, Francois. And unless there's any other things you would like to share with us before we wrap, we might call it there. So thank you very much
for having us. It was great.
Yeah, real pleasure. Thanks. And great having a conversation. Always love these talks in the .NET ecosystem, as well as learning about, another sort of independent provider in the broader ecosystem. So thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. All right. And thank you to the listeners. Every time we do one of these.